There, my name is Shane Meserve. I'm with Given Hour California, and I'm here just to talk briefly about some of the signs that we might see in children of a couple of different age groups if they have been involved with a trauma of some kind, if they've had a trauma happen to them. These are some of the pretty common signs that they're struggling with something that's happened. One of the first things is you'll see a dramatic change in behavior. You know, children have changes in behavior all the time, but when you see a big swing from one end of the spectrum to another, it's usually a good sign that something's really concerning them and they don't know how to manage it. They might be having tantrums, or they might go the opposite route, which is to be really quiet and really withdrawn and just not say a word. They might have a very strong fear of being separated from their caregivers. This young children, by the way, is sort of, you know, up to age 5-ish. I know that's a wide age range, but they might have a lot of fear of being separated from their caregivers. They're the children that, you know, mom or dad is trying to get out the door for the day, and they're the ones holding for dear life to the ankle and crying because they're being left. So they could have a very strong fear of being left behind. The opposite might also occur, where they're just willing to attach to anyone who gives them the slightest bit of attention or eye contact, or anything at all. And a young child who's really struggling might just glom onto that person because they're really craving that attention or that love. Another one is they might be easily alarmed. They might not be sleeping well, and you're going to hear this. You're going to hear sleep go all the way from very young children all the way up through us as adults. Your sleep is really affected when your mind is racing about something difficult that's happened. Another really big sign for young children would be acting out their trauma during play. Younger children, that age before they're really very verbal, or they don't have the vocabulary to tell you about their trauma. They may act it out with their dolls, or they may act it out in their dramatic play that they do with their friends. So that's a very common thing for kids to act out that trauma with using objects as opposed to talking about themselves going through a trauma. Some poor eating behaviors, maybe some physical manifestation of that would be weight loss, some developmental delays, and regression to younger behaviors. This is where an example might be, a 3-4-year-old who's been potty trained suddenly goes back to not just having an accident once in a while, because that's fairly common, but going back to not being potty trained, right, and needing to wear diapers all the time. That's a really good indication that they're reacting to something scary that's happened. The next age group I'll talk about is school-age children. So again, this is a big age range. This is in generalizations, and we talk about something being typical versus something being normal, because normal is an eye of the beholder. But the typical range of school-age children behaviors that you might see, they might start having some really intrusive thoughts or images of the trauma. Again, kind of that swing, that behavior swing. So they might be really, really aggressive, or they might be really, really withdrawn, right? Acting out trauma with aggression, is fairly typical for this age group. They might be really worried about their safety or the safety of their family members. I know when my nieces were little, there was one of the school shootings occurred, and my older niece, who was probably 8 or 9 at the time, got really scared about her younger sister. She got really concerned about what was going to happen. If something happened to her, what was going to happen to her younger sister, who is 3 years younger than she is. So, just really, and she's kind of a worrywart anyway. Sometimes kids are just worrywarts from birth, but worrying about other people's safety in a kind of not typical way for a school-age child. Avoidance of previously enjoyed activities. Maybe your kiddo has been all about soccer all the time, wanting to talk about it, wanting to watch it, wanting to play it, always having the ball with them, to all of a sudden not being interested in it anymore. Now, in this age range, there are kids change their interests, right? They're trying out a lot of different things. So it might be typical, or it might be okay that they're changing their idea about what they want to spend their time doing. But it also might mean that something happened at soccer and they just don't want to go anymore. They don't want to deal with it. So it's just something to think about if they really were enjoying a particular activity and then they're not anymore. Again, sleep. Changes in school performance, you'll see this here, and then also with adolescents, which we'll talk about next. But maybe a kiddo who's been really, really conscientious about school suddenly loses interest or stops getting the good grades or stop caring about the good grades. Difficulty concentrating, which could go back to the sleep issue. If they're not sleeping well, then, we all know this from ourselves too. If they're not sleeping well, they may be having issues with staying on task or being able to concentrate. Guilt or shame. So, a 9-year-old has certain things they feel guilty about, like they didn't make their bed, or maybe they didn't pick up their dishes, or maybe they're mean to their younger sister or brother, right? There are certain things that this age group may feel guilty about. But if it seems out of the ordinary for your child, if it seems like all of a sudden they're really, really concerned about their bodies, or, if just all of a sudden things change, that's definitely something to pay attention to. Then we get into adolescence, and this is a really, there's so much going on with there's so much going on with all of these age groups, right? Because their bodies are developing, their brains are developing. Their brain development is a big piece of all this too. So there's a lot going on with adolescence anyway. And there are some signs that maybe there's some trauma going on, or they're still managing some trauma from earlier in their life that was not dealt with at that time. There was no intervention given at that time. So again, you see that changes in behavior. You see poor decision making. Now this is a big one for adolescents, because adolescents are still working on their decision making skills anyway, that frontal lobe piece of their brain, which helps them decide about risk, what's a good risk, what's a bad risk, they're still learning about what should I be doing with my time versus what I want to do with my time, right? And deciding how they're going to manage that. So poor decision making and risk-taking behaviors is kind of typical for an adolescent anyway, but an adolescent that's dealing with a trauma, again, is going to be more of an extreme example of maybe taking really bigger risks than a kiddo that hasn't dealt with trauma. Aggressive, disruptive, or delinquent behavior. So again, we see an escalation here. Being aggressive or disruptive when you're 9 can be very different than when you're 15 or 16. So just really paying attention. Again, could this be something that's happened to them when they were younger that just was not really managed at the time? Is it something that's happening now? It's definitely something to pay attention to. Again, being withdrawn as the other end of that spectrum. Sleep disturbances, substance use. So this is when we get more seriously into drugs and alcohol. They certainly have more access to it at this age, and this, and again, this could go back to poor decision making, because some teenagers use substances, without trauma, but more serious use, or getting into it a little bit sooner maybe than is typical, would be something to be concerned about. Self-harm, this is when they start cutting themselves, when they putting themselves in really physically risky situations, putting themselves physically in a place that's not safe for them. And then again, changes in school performance. So again, trauma in adolescence could be a little bit harder to see, just because of all the different things that are going on for them. But we trust our gut, and we know, if you know your kid, or you're in touch with other people who maybe spend more time with your kid or whatever, trying to decide if this is typical behavior for them, or if it's out of the ordinary, could help decide if there's a trauma going on. Okay, thanks so much.